Hello, everybody. Welcome to Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 2. We have a co-host on with us, Sierra, and right now she's posting on the chat box where you can find copies of this webinar as well as other webinars. Also, just contact information about us if you want to schedule a consultation after this. And she's going to let you know how you can get, I believe we send these to you in the mail, email. Okay, so just a couple of things before we get started. If you have any questions as we're going along, which is fine, just go ahead and type them in the question and answer box or even in the chat box, but I won't get to them until the end. Okay, and if you need any help with anything that's not content related, Sarah, the co-host, would be happy to help you. Okay, so let's get started. The Chapter 2, okay, the literature review. Probably one of the most challenging chapters because it's big and it involves a lot of information usually. So kind of getting your head around it, organizing the information is usually, one of the biggest challenges. So here's what we're going to cover today in the lit review: introduction, literature search strategy, theoretical framework, review of the literature, which is the bulk really of the literature review and a summary. But before we get started, let's just talk a little bit about, kind of pull back and talk about the purpose of the lit review, because I think if you understand what the lit review is doing, what it's for, what its purpose is, it kind of helps you when you're writing it. So the literature review does act like a context for your study, right? You're reviewing research, mostly current research or recent research on your topic to see what other researchers have done. So it kind of provides a context, but that's not kind of the real purpose. The real purpose is to, basically it's a large argument for your research problem, for why you're conducting your study, for why your study is necessary. It kind of supports your research problem, which is, drives your study. So it's analytical. It's not just, it's an evaluative. It's not just kind of descriptive. In other words, you don't want to just describe the studies and what they did. You also want to be analytical to some degree, with that eye towards that larger argument of why your study is needed, right? Here's what people have done in the research. Here's what previous researchers have focused on. However, they haven't focused on what it is you're doing, your research problem. So you want to keep that in your mind as you move through the the lit review, that it is kind of setting that up, is making an argument for why your study is needed and for why to support your research problem, to show what's in the literature and by contrast what's not or what's still needed. Okay, so the introduction. Just like introductions of other chapters, the purpose of the introduction is to really kind of just orient your reader about where you are, what's going on. So it's always helpful to restate the purpose of your study, remind the reader of why your study is important and the need for your study. You could even, if you want to, preview contents of the chapter that are going to come. And that's, it's a brief introduction, maybe a page or so, probably not more than that, if, maybe less than a page. Let me stop right here, and you can hear me say this several times throughout the presentation. This is a good general template, but always obtain your school's template that they want you to follow, because there may be some minor differences, but you want to follow theirs. Again, this is a good kind of standard general template, but just obtain your school's template if they have one, to see exactly what they're looking for. Okay, usually next after the introduction is something called the literature search strategy. And what this is it's a small section that it describes how you conducted your search for the literature that you're reviewing in the chapter. Why is that important? Well, for one thing, if people wanted to replicate it, I don't know why they would, but if they wanted to kind of follow your steps, they could do it. But the larger issue is that it shows your readers and your chair, your committee, how you conducted your search and that your search was comprehensive, right? Because that's what you want to do with the lit review. You want to cast a net that gets everything that's relevant to your study, right? And how do you show your people that you did that? And part of that is in this section here. So you want to talk about what you searched, terms, databases, any qualifying, any ways that you qualified your search. And this will show them that the steps that you took to ensure a comprehensive literature search. So you want to describe your search for the research, and that involves, just starting off with a simple declarative sentence like, you used your university's library to search for relevant materials, right? Or your library's online portal to search for relevant material. List any databases or search tools that you used, right? So any specialized databases, like if you're in psychology, there's one called Psych Articles. If you're in education, there's something called ERIC, a database called ERIC. It's an acronym. So some databases are really kind of fundamental to certain fields. You can also talk about the search tools that you use, like Google Scholar, or something like Academic Search Complete. That's a search tool usually within academic libraries. And what these are, like Google Scholar, it searches multiple databases, right? It searches a lot of databases. So you can cover a lot of ground with these kind of these search tools. So any databases that you search specifically, any search tools that you used, list those. Sometimes your chair will want you to look at a specialized, like a journal in your field. If you searched specific journals, you want to mention that. List the key terms that you used for your search, right? So your key terms, these aren't going to be anything surprising. These are going to correspond to your variables that you're studying, your factors, the major concepts that are associated with your study. So list the key terms and any combinations that you used for the search. And this last one's important. Include any way that you filtered or qualified your search. So some general ones are, you want only, when you're searching, you only want material return that's full text, okay, or you want material that's only in English, okay. But the last two are more important: data publication and peer-reviewed academic articles. So the first one, data publication, that matters if your school has some kind of cutoff date for the material they want reviewed, and usually it's good to keep things more recent in your lit review. That's because things change. If you're using studies, you're reviewing studies from 20 years ago, those may not be relevant anymore. The findings may not be relevant. So it's always a good rule of thumb just to keep the material as recent as possible that you review in your literature review. Some schools have guidelines for that, or not guidelines. They won't let you go like past 5 years or something, and they won't let you go past 10 years. So they want things, that you review published recent within 5 years or 5 to 7 years or 10 years. And if that's the case, again, check your template or check with your chair to see if they have any kind of requirement like that. Some schools don't have those requirements. So then you have a little more freedom. But again, it's always, ideally, it's always best to stay recent because again, things from 15, 20 years ago may not be relevant. Now, that's not to say that some studies and some theories and things are not foundational. There are foundational studies, and if they're foundational and they're important and they're older, you can include them, but usually tend to stay more recent. And again, check with your school's requirements because some schools do have those requirements. And I've also seen cases where the schools don't really have requirements, but a committee, and so the student just pulls in information from 10, 20 years ago. And a committee member will say, oh, this stuff needs to be recent. You need to update it all. So another good reason to to stay as recent as possible with the material that you're reviewing. And it also makes sense in the sense that you want to give kind of a snapshot of the current state of, or the recent state of research on your topic, right? And things from 20, 30 years ago don't do that. Okay, so if you did kind of have a cutoff date, you want to put it here in the literature search strategy, right? So you primarily included things published from 2017 onward to 2022. Also, the real important peer-reviewed studies, peer-reviewed articles. This is real important because the peer-reviewed article is the gold standard for the lit review. I mean, you can use books, but you shouldn't use them sparingly. You can use material from websites, but you should only use it for informational purposes and for statistics and things. You shouldn't be actually reviewing material from a website. So you should be reviewing, when they say the literature, the research, we're talking about peer-reviewed academic articles or peer-reviewed academic studies. And how do you know if something is peer-reviewed? Well, usually, right when you're searching, you're in your academic library, on the search page, it'll have information about the articles, and usually right there it will say peer-reviewed. And again, if you click on, if you make that if you say that you want peer-reviewed articles returned to you, only peer-reviewed articles, then what you should get back should be only peer-reviewed articles. So you can tell that way right on the search screen whether it's peer-reviewed, but those are the ones you want. So that means it's not like newspaper articles or magazine articles or things like that. They're scholarly articles. And peer-reviewed just means that these articles have been through a review process of people in the field, of specialists in the field. So they have a high scholarly quality to them. So that's the literature search strategy. How long should that be? Probably a page, maybe not even a page. And for some of these sections, especially like this, where it's kind of, you might get it, it might seem a little tricky. See if you can get an example from your school or from your chair of a dissertation in your area, similar kind of dissertation, and just see how people have handled these sections. Sometimes it's just good to have an example at hand when you sit down to write. Okay. Next, the theoretical framework. Again, check your school's template because the theoretical framework can appear in schools are different. Sometimes it appears only in chapter 1. Sometimes it appears only in chapter 2. But what's most common is that the theoretical framework appears in chapter 1, you introduce it, and then in chapter 2, you elaborate on it more. That seems to be more of the norm. So the theoretical framework would go here. So to handle the theoretical framework, it's going to sound a lot like what you did in chapter 1. It's going to just have more elaboration to it, right? Who developed the theory? obviously have this sourced, right, with the year. What did they develop the theory to explain? Because that's what theories do. They help researchers explain things. What did they develop the theory for? You want to define the theory, right? Along with any associated components, like let's just say transformational leadership theory. It has 4 specific components. You want to define those components as well. Discuss a little bit what researchers have used the theory for, what other researchers have used it for, and try to connect it to your study. How does the theory help explain what you're going to be studying? How is it going to help guide what you're doing? How does it connect to what you're doing? And sometimes for chapter 2, part of the theoretical framework section may include pulling in a few studies, like 2 or 3 studies, recent studies that have used the theory. So you talk a little bit about those studies and how the researchers use the theory, and that shows that researchers are still using the theory, and that it's important, it's usable. Okay. That's a theoretical framework. Now, another thing, theoretical, sometimes you hear the term conceptual framework. So theoretical framework, conceptual framework, which one is right? Which one do you need? I take a real practical approach to that, and theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies. Conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. And everything applies that I said about the theoretical framework applies to the conceptual framework. And another thing about the conceptual framework is that for qualitative studies, the conceptual framework will also help guide your interview questions. Okay, so next is the actual review of the literature. Now, this is the bulk of the literature review, right? You have the introduction, the theoretical framework, and at the end you have the summary, but I'd say 80% of the chapter is going to be the actual review of the literature. So you're going to have a lot of material. You're going to have a lot of studies to cover, a lot of research. So one of your big challenges is going to be, how to organize all this information, right? And what you want to do is you want to follow your basically what you're studying specifically, like your factors, your variables, your major concepts, what it is you're looking at. So you want to have sections, subsections for those components. So you want to use headers, organize your material into sections based on those concepts, those factors. And usually when you start a new section, define the term or whatever it is you're looking at, you're talking about, talk a little bit about why it's important, how it's important to the research, and then you can go on to start kind of discussing the studies and the points from the studies. And let's see what that looks like, because what you don't want to do is just kind of review one study after another. Right, one study. So you have basically an annotated bibliography. Professors don't like that. So they want you to synthesize material. You might hear this word, synthesis. So let's take a look at what that looks like. I see I have a question there, but I'll get to it at the end. Okay, so what is synthesis? Synthesis is combining parts to form a whole, right? Putting things together to form something larger. So you want to combine information from studies to help make your points. The easiest way to start organizing the material, or the most fundamental level, is at the paragraph level, right? And this is where we just have to remember what we learned in middle school or wherever we learned it. That the paragraph involves a topic sentence, evidence, or discussion of that topic, several sentences, and the concluding or summary sentence, right? That kind of wraps things up, or maybe it might transition to the next topic. Okay. And so here's an example. Oops, sorry. All right, this is synthesis example. At the paragraph level, I have it color coded. So if you see the topic sentence, research has mostly shown that health literacy is an important factor in diabetic self-control and positive outcomes. That's the topic. And then the green material, which I don't have it all highlighted, but from the top of the green to the bottom of the green, that's all material that is evidence or helps support that topic sentence. And what that is material from the studies, right? So Anders et al. Conducted a systematic review on the concept of health literacy and how it relates to self-efficacy, diabetic control, and diabetes outcomes. Anders found, okay, what he found. And then I have other information from other studies in there as well that support the topic. But this is where you want to bring in, this is the synthesis part, right? You're bringing in information, relevant information from studies, usually about what they studied, how they studied it, and what they found, that helps to support the points you want to make. That synthesis. See, then the next one is Gregory's study, and then the next one is Talbot study. And then we'll get to the summary sentence, which is empirical evidence from recent research largely supports that diabetic health literacy is a vital component of patients' self-efficacy, diabetic control, and clinical outcomes. Okay, so that's what they mean by synthesis. That's kind of organizing it at the paragraph level. Then you would go on to your next point, right? And bring in material from studies to make your next point. Okay, and we do have some analysis in here too. Let me jump ahead real quick. So analysis, and then I'll come back. So analysis, which again, the lit review is not just descriptive, right? Remember that it's not just a review of the research, even though it's called a literature review. It involves evaluation and analysis. So you have to be, there's some critique in there. It's not just description. So analysis of the research involves noting shortcomings or gaps of the studies. In other words, any weaknesses you want to highlight the studies as part of analysis. You want to note trends in the research too. And wherever you can, reiterate the research problem and the need for your study. Like, so if somebody does a study that was very close to what you're going to be doing, but they didn't cover something that you're going to be covering, you're going to want to note that, right? Because remember, the whole lit review culminates in an argument for conducting your study, right? Or why your study is needed. So anytime you can reiterate the gaps or, you know, the research problem that you're going to be covering, that's always a good thing. So to come back here, there is some analysis in here. So if you notice in the first sentence, it says recent research has mostly, that little word mostly, shown that diabetic health literacy is an important factor in diabetic self-control and positive outcomes. Because if you look at the supporting material, two of the studies, Anders and Gregory, they support that sentence. But the last one does not. Phillips, if you look at, I guess it's the second to the last sentence, unlike Anders et al. And Gregory et al., Phillips et al. Found no statistically significant relationship between diabetes knowledge and glycemic control, which they attributed to a small sample size and possibly errors associated with self-reported instruments. So that's where the mostly comes in, right? So most of the research did support that topic. There was one study that didn't, but I accounted for that. And then in the summary sentence, empirical evidence from recent research largely supports. So there's another qualifying term, largely. Again, most research does. There's some that doesn't, which I accounted for. And also there's a little bit of analysis here where it says, or explanation of the non-significant findings, right? Phillips et al. Found no statistically significant relationship between diabetes knowledge and glycemic control, which they attributed to a small sample size and possibly errors associated with self-reported instruments. So there's a little bit of analysis in there. a little bit of explanation about why their findings may have been different. So that's a good example of what your professors are talking about when they're talking about synthesis, like bringing similar information from studies together to make a point. And again, some analysis in there as well. Okay, and that gets us to the end. I mean, I know it seems kind of a quick overview of the content of the chapter, but all the chapters are different, right? I mean, because all studies are different. The material, the research material is different. But just remember to, to organize the material largely with headings, using your major concepts, what you're studying, your factors, your variables as headers, and having the synthesis and analysis throughout. Okay, so for the summary, it's like other summaries for other chapters, right? You want to recap the major points from the chapter. And in the lit review summary, it's important. You also want to remind the reader of the research problem based on what you just reviewed, right? Based on what is in the literature and what is not in the literature. In other words, what the gaps are, or what the gap is that you're going to be addressing. Reiterate the need for your study. Okay. And this information, this is who we are, what we provide, our contact information. So if you think you're interested in just hearing what we offer to see if that's right for you, feel free to reach out. And I'll take questions now. I have a couple here. If you want to type in any questions now, go ahead. Let's see, why can't we use conceptual framework in a quantitative study? I suppose you could. I haven't seen people use conceptual framework in a quantitative study. Like I said, I take a practical approach to it. I think probably because there are theories for quantitative study. There are quantitative studies involve instruments to gather information, and those instruments have theoretical foundations. So there's usually some kind of theory behind the quantitative instrument. If we're using two theories to check relationship or effect in a quantitative study, then it will be theoretical framework or conceptual framework. That would be theoretical framework. Yeah, and sometimes you have to use two theories, right? So if you're studying, let's say, emotional intelligence and transformational leadership, you would need a theory of emotional intelligence and a theory of transformational leadership. And together, those two would constitute your theoretical framework. Sometimes you can use one theory, but if you need to use two because you have two different constructs, you can use two. What you don't want to do is kind of go wild and start pulling in theories and saying, hey, I'm going to use this theory and this theory and this theory. Keep it streamlined. You only need whatever you need. If you need one theory, fine. If you need two, that's fine too. But they should adhere very closely to what you're doing. Okay, any other questions? Oops, sorry. Any questions about the lit review? Everybody's good with the lit review? It's a big chapter for sure. It's challenging. It's long. Usually, I've seen 10-page lit reviews, but I've seen 80-page lit reviews, and I've seen everything in between. Usually the sweet spot is around 25 to 30 pages. It's usually what I see most of. But again, check with your chair, check with your school template. They may have specific page requirements, but I'd say 25 to 30 pages is pretty typical. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to let everybody go. I wish you a good rest of your day. And oh, I got one more. Hold on. Can we have contrast studies in literature review or in discussion? You mean studies that don't contrast studies? They find something different than what you're looking at. Yeah, I mean, you have to just kind of review what's out there. If studies have contrasting information, then yeah, you have to, you can include that. Yeah, but you should always be driving the point home about, the need for your own study, even if it's contrasting information. What theory can be used for mixed methods research? It depends on what you're studying. There's not a specific theory for mixed methods. I think you would just need to, and all mixed methods are different. Some are weighted heavily quantitative, and you're just using like a little qualitative portion to help explain the quantitative part. So it really depends. I don't know if you need two theories for mixed methods, one for the quantitative and one for the qualitative. Again, if it's like primarily quantitative and has a little qualitative part, you could probably get away with one theory for the quantitative part, or if you need two theories for the quantitative part. But I don't know if you always need a theory for each portion of the study. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but. Okay, any other questions? All right, everybody, well, have a good rest of your day. And again, reach out if you want to just get some more information about what we offer. All right, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. Have a good day.